Well, I think the reason that this topic came up, of the history of the Doctrine of the Afterlife, was my rather quick and almost throwaway comment about the fact that for most of the Bible, most of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, this is not something that is a focus at the very least, and may actually be something that is explicitly rejected, explicitly not held to, right? So, on the one hand, if we attune our ears to it, we can notice the absence of the idea of the afterlife in certain places, right? So, for instance, we take a look at the book of Amos, for instance. We take a look at books like, First and Second Kings, and we read time and again of judgment coming upon the nation for injustice, for worshiping other gods. And not once do any of the prophets, not once does the author of this account of Israel's history say, these people are going to hell because of their worship or because of their evil deeds or something like that. It's always disaster will come upon the nation, exile, conquest, famine, plague. And so what we see there is belief that rewards and punishments are meted out in history, right, rather than in some time after history or after our lives are over.
And so does that maybe, there's a verse someplace in the Bible that says the sins of the father will, fall down upon the son, or some words to that effect.
There are words to that effect, and then we get Ezekiel quoting a proverb that people said that the parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. So in other words, it's one generation is eating something, right, and then we have to update with some kind of sour candy or something probably, but the parents are eating the sour drops and the children's lips are puckering or something like that would probably be our equivalent. But the idea being that one generation does something and the consequences, the brunt of it is borne by the next generation.
And that's very true today.
And there's certainly truth in it, but Ezekiel was also resisting that and saying that each soul will give an account for its own sins. Precisely because if one generation screws things up and the next generation suffers as a result directly from the things that the previous generation did, then there's a kind of there's an unfairness, but it's logical, right? If we pollute the environment and our kids live with the consequences of that, it wasn't their fault that we polluted the environment, but that's not surprising. But if we're talking about God punishing the children for the sins of the parents, then that can seem like there's something unfair about that, right? And so that's why I think Ezekiel was giving some pushback on it, especially as sometimes it seemed like those who were most concerned about doing the right thing were supposedly suffering as a result of what others had done. Seemed to have gotten off scot-free, right? And we get this in, for instance, in 2 Kings, right, when we have the accounts of the king who's considered arguably the best king in the nation's history, and a king who's considered one of the worst in the history of the kingdom. Right? So Hezekiah introduces these reforms in worship, centralizes worship, does a lot of things that the king was supposed to do. I'm going to pick it up in 2 Kings 21, but I'm referring to Hezekiah, which is the several chapters before that. And then in 2 Kings 21, Manasseh undoes Hezekiah's reforms. So reintroduces the worship of Baal and Asherah and these kinds of things. And so he's considered a really terrible king from the perspective of his author. And then we're told in 2 Kings 21:18, Manasseh rested with his fathers. It's good. Some versions translate, I think it's the New Revised Standard Version translates it, Manasseh slept with his ancestors. And I've had students wonder if that was a reference to some kind of necrophilia or something like that. But he rested in peace alongside his ancestors. Right? So he was buried alongside his ancestors in the family tomb. Right?
Is this 2 Kings?
Yes, 2 Kings 21, verse 18, as I said. And then Josiah, right, who is famous for putting things back, not just putting things back the way they were supposed to be, but doing it to an extent that no one else had previously. Best king in the whole of this account, arguably, from the author's perspective. And he's wounded in battle, and they have to carry him back, right? And this is in verses 29 and 30 of 2 Kings 23. I assume these stories are at least vaguely familiar. And so, what's the moral of this story? You can be the worst kings in the nation's history and be buried alongside your ancestors honorably. You can do what God wanted according to the law and be killed in battle. You can die violently. And so people didn't have to look hard at real life to realize that not everybody gets what they deserve. And that's part of the reason why we will get the doctrine of the afterlife, is that, in essence, that problem of evil, as it's known philosophically, that question of why do bad things happen to good people, and arguably even worse, good things happen to bad people. Right? I mean, that's the one that really gets our goat sometimes.
Yes.
Right? But before we get there, right, we have to realize that really what we're dealing with, is not, a set of texts in which, from the get-go, people are given, a divinely ordained answer that descends from the sky and says, here's what you should think for all time. What we have here, what we see in the pages of Scripture, is authors who are formulating monotheism for the first time. So they've got this idea that God is one, and that all the divine power that they detect among the forces of nature, and that others attribute to a variety of gods, are the work of one God. And so what we're dealing with here is really the kind of what we might call the literary and intellectual history of monotheism. People working out, okay, so then how do we think about what happens in the world in light of that belief? And it's a slow process by which people reflect on these things. If we take a look at the book of Job, the book of Job is about a man who is as righteous as anyone's ever been, right? God's showing him off in the celestial court, and boasting of him. And yet he suffers terribly, so much so that his children, his belongings, all are taken from him within a matter of hours, right? So that the servants, the single servant that has survived in each instance lines up to bring the bad news, right? And so this is not a true story about actual events, right? There's humor and sarcasm and irony and things like that. That's mostly in poetic form, right? And so this is really a philosophical thought experiment. Right? Take the most righteous person there's ever been, up until that point at least, and make him suffer as much as anybody ever could suffer, and then ask the question, how do you make sense of this? And the reader of the book gets some input that Job never finds out about, right? That essentially there's been this celestial wager, and a very good point has been made in the celestial court, but which is never revealed to Job, which is that if we lived in a world in which people always got what they deserved, then there might not be room for genuine goodness, strangely enough. What I often say to my students when we talk about the book of Job is, if we think of the quintessential good deed, although I'm not sure how useful it is in real life, but helping a little old lady across the street, right, is the one that always is the stereotypical good deed. If every time you helped a little old lady across the street, because most of my students have never actually done this, but if it was discovered that every time you did that, an extra $20 bill appeared in your wallet, people would be fighting over who gets to help the little old ladies across the street. They'd be doing it all the time. Right? But would it be a good deed any longer if you're always rewarded for it? Right? And so that's really the main theme in the book of Job. It's not so much offering an explanation of why bad things happen to good people as to saying that if this were not the case, then far from it being a much more moral universe, it might actually undermine the possibility of genuine morality, because being good ultimately depends on us being willing to do things for others even when we don't benefit from it ourselves. If we look at the things that Job says about human life, though, it's very interesting, right? Take a look at Job chapter 7. Right? This is Job speaking. He said, if we start at verse 6, "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle." Not a very useful image for us because we don't do the weaving, but days pass quickly and they come to an end without hope. "Remember, O God, that my life is but a breath. My eyes will never see happiness again. The eye that now sees me will see me no longer. You will look for me, but I will be no more. As a cloud vanishes and is gone, so he who goes down to the grave does not return. He will never come again to his house. His place will know him no more." And he says similar things elsewhere in the book, right? Even in the same chapter in verse 21, right? "Why do you not pardon my offenses and forgive my sins? For I will soon lie down in the dust. You will search for me, but I will be no more." And so Job is very explicit that he's going to die and he will be no more. Right? He's not going to return to life. He does express the hope at one point, the desire, the wish that God would vent his wrath, hide Job in the grave, and then bring him back once his anger is past and give him a chance to resume life. But it's not something that he takes for granted as a reality. Right? And so we have places where if there were belief in rewards and punishments in an afterlife, we would expect to see it mentioned, and it's not. And we have some places where an author is quite explicit, right, or a character in a book is quite explicit in saying, "Go down to the grave, do not return." And so belief in an afterlife is absent, and it's not because no one had thought of it yet. When Israel as a nation was making its beginnings, the pyramids were already ancient historic monuments. Right? And the reason for the pyramids is Egyptian belief in an afterlife. Right? And the idea that you prepare people for this journey into an afterlife. And so it's not as though people did not have the concept anywhere in the world, and the Israelites get there first. They seem to have made, it might be a conscious decision to not go in the direction that the Egyptians had gone, perhaps.
James,
Yeah.
I'm sorry I don't have a text for this, although I've got a note about the word grave.
We might be able to find it together.
The concept of Sheol.
Yeah.
Isn't there some life connected with that?
That's a great question, right? And that's actually what we're going to talk about next.
Okay.
Sheol, you'll see it sometimes left untranslated, right, to sort of sidestep the issue. You'll see people translate it as hell, but that's quite dubious in a lot of ways. Although it's useful if you're looking for a way to avoid swearing, if you want to say "what the Sheol," people won't know what you're saying, but those who do get what you're saying will get a chuckle out of it. But Sheol is at the grave, right? Is it an underworld? What is it? It's at best, right? The Israelites may have had some sense that there's something after death.
Spell Sheol.
Sheol. But it's at best a shadowy kind of existence, right? It's not something that's clear, and
There is an existence
possibly,
of sorts, right? Yeah.
And whether it's, one of the questions we might ask is, okay, is there some kind of existence? And maybe. Is it conscious existence? And that's harder to answer. The next story to turn to, arguably, is the famous one about Saul going to the witch of Endor. Right? That's in 1 Samuel chapter 28, where he goes to this woman to bring up, as a medium, as a spiritist, right, to bring up from the dead. But this is 1 Samuel 28. Bring Samuel up from the dead. And so,
And in verse 11, whom shall I bring up for you?
bring up Samuel.
Bring up Samuel.
But let's look at what the woman sees, right? The woman said, verse 13, "I see a spirit," or "I see gods," it says in the footnote, "coming up out of the ground." Right? What does he look like? An old man wearing a robe is coming up. Right? And so then Samuel says to Saul, verse 15, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Right? So you get the sense that death is like being asleep, and it's an image that's often used in the Bible as well as elsewhere. And let's take a look at what Samuel actually says. There's some interesting things here.
Interesting. My Bible has absolutely no footnote for that verse whatsoever.
Okay.
Not going to touch it.
Yeah.
Which one is it?
15.
Yeah. Is it verse 15 or verse 13? Where it says, I see a spirit
Yeah.
coming up out of the ground, or I see God's coming up out of the ground.
Well,
I'll
it
need to
doesn't
look
have
it
one
up
for
first.
13
Yeah.
either.
Okay.
I have none.
Well, this is, yeah, it talks about gods.
Yeah. But verse 19 is interesting, right? The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. So in other words, where Samuel is, they will be. So in other words, he's predicting their death. Right? And so another thing that's noteworthy about Sheol is that it's kind of the great equalizer, right? So everybody ends up in Sheol, whether it's a shadowy underworld or the grave that's referred to.
Mine says the world of the dead.
Yeah.
Is that where the concept of purgatory comes from?
Not directly. Right?
Oh, I didn't mean to open a can of worms.
Oh, no, we were going to open that can of worms.
Oh,
Right?
okay.
That can of worms needs to be opened. And worms are used in imagery related to death, and so it's an appropriate image that you brought into the picture there, arguably.
Glad I could help.
Uh, But one of the things we'll see when we get to the New Testament is that there are references to a place where the worm does not die and things like that. And sometimes that's treated as reference to eternal conscious torment. But of course, the worm imagery is about the flesh decaying, and it's about death. And so why that is treated as imagery of conscious torment, you have to add to the picture the idea that maybe God is preventing the flesh from decaying, and so it's constantly being eaten by worms. But even then, it doesn't necessarily give you conscious torment. It gives you, something terrible happening to the body at best. So,
It isn't, when we die, doesn't our soul immediately, I've always been taught that our soul immediately goes back to God.
that's one view that people have. Yeah. And part of the question is, do we know, and can we just look at the Bible and say, okay, here's a text that says this, therefore that's what we should think? One thing that people have tried to do is to take everything you find in the Bible and put it all together in the hopes it'll come up with one clear, coherent doctrine. And there are, I think, two problems with that. One is that I don't think it works, because we've already seen there's some texts here that seem to say, I'll go down to the grave and I will not return. I think you have to acknowledge that author doesn't have the view that later authors will have. And so you need to have, you need to leave room either for development or progressive revelation, whichever you want to call it, and whichever is your viewpoint. And so if that's the case, then we probably shouldn't be trying to fit all the pieces together. But the other thing is that if we were supposed to have one clear, coherent doctrine, then we could have just been given a book of doctrine, and then we'd have it, right? And so the idea that the reason to have the Bible with all these different views is so that we can treat it like a puzzle, put the pieces together, and put together the one true doctrine, seems problematic, not least because there are different ways you can assemble these pieces into a doctrine. And lots of people who think that the Bible is to be treated that way come up with different constructions out of the pieces. And so,
Isn't that how we got so many denominations?
absolutely.
It's, I agree that, that if we see the development of the understanding of God, just in the names for God, until finally God says, my name is I am that I am. And that kind of, at that point, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot more development in the Old Testament. I may be wrong on that, but I go from the God of the thunder, or the God of the mountain, the God of the wind, or whatever, to the God who exists everywhere. And that is a development within the eyes of the Israelites. Then the next step is that for me, is that the prophet talk about a Messiah that is coming. And that there's going to be a different kind of relationship when the Messiah comes. And the suffering servant, here's all this person going to suffer and die. And but that's not the end, because when Jesus comes, he suffers, he dies, and he rises again. Then we're left with a conundrum. We can't stay with the idea that was in the Old Testament because now we have a new understanding.
Yeah, well, actually, there's, belief in resurrection in Judaism predates belief that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Oh, yeah,
so it's
right
kind
here.
it's kind of the background to that. And so there's, where we get it first in the Bible is apparently in the book of Daniel. Right? And the book of Daniel in Christian Bibles is placed among the prophets, but in the Jewish canon it's actually among the writings and thought to be written significantly later. And the context that's thought to be that which shaped the book of Daniel is what's known as the Maccabean revolt. So the persecution of the Jewish people, I won't go into the whole history. It's fascinating. I would happily go there, but unless you ask me to, I will spare you a long historical detail. But suffice it to say that a Syrian king had outlawed the Jewish law, the observance of the Jewish law, and people were being persecuted, were being arrested, were being executed for observing the Jewish law. And in that era, right, the temple is desecrated. He rededicates the temple to Zeus Olympus or Baal Shemem, right, Lord of Heaven. Sacrifices a pig on the altar, and it's the rededication of the temple that is celebrated at Hanukkah. Right? So that's the thing that might make it familiar to some of you. But during this period, you don't just have people who happen to be righteous happening to suffer. You have those who observe the Jewish law, so the people who are being most faithful to God, to what they believe God wants them to do, being the ones who are singled out for persecution and for death. While those who abandon observance of the Jewish law, basically who decide to be unfaithful to God, have an easy go of it. Life is easy for them. Right? They avoid persecution. And so then you have a bigger problem than just, well, it seems like sometimes bad things happen to good people. Right? What does it say if those who are most righteous are singled out for persecution and death? Where is God's justice if God doesn't do anything about this? And it's in that context, it would seem, that we first get the formulation of this conviction that a God who is not bound by time, is not bound by, or limited by life and death, even death will not prevent God from rewarding those who are faithful. And so, towards the end of the book of Daniel, right, we get this saying, Daniel chapter 12, it says, "At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt." And so that seems to be the place where we first get this clear articulation of rewards and punishment in an afterlife. And the thing to note there is that it's not rewards and punishments in a spiritual afterlife, to which one simply goes after one dies, but resurrection. Right? So the raising of the dead from the dust of the earth to awaken again, right, to return to life. And that's the viewpoint that we see, for the most part, in the New Testament as well, that not only is there an afterlife, but it's in the form of resurrection. If you're familiar with some of the major Jewish parties in the time of Jesus, they included the Sadducees, and the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection and spirit and things like that, precisely because they were conservative, right? So it's largely absent from the scriptures, and so it seemed like a late innovation to them. The Pharisees adhered to resurrection of the dead, and that God would raise the dead and reward and punish people. And when you get this imagery of a new heavens and a new earth, it reflects that conviction that human beings are not made to simply have some part of us depart from bodily existence and go somewhere else, but that God made us as what we might call, if we wanted a technical term for it, psychosomatic unities. Right? So spirit, mind, consciousness, body, physicality, all of that sort of wrapped together as one inseparable whole. Right? That's the classic biblical view, rather than the view that predominated among the Greeks in the time of the New Testament, which was that we're spirits trapped in a body. But that view has come to predominate in Christianity, right? And given that there's been development, right, we don't have the easy option of simply saying, okay, but well, once we get to the New Testament, then they're thinking in these terms, so let's just go with that, because there are probably still further things that we need to think about. Right? There are questions that are raised by the study of the brain. Right? When Paul talks about thinking, he talks about the heart, because he, like Aristotle, thought in his heart that that was where thinking takes place. We connect it with the brain now. We have a different perspective on these things, and it's, I think, perfectly acceptable for us to possibly go in different directions as a result of that. But one thing that we risk losing if we focus on an idea like going to heaven when we die rather than being raised in the resurrection of the last day is that oftentimes that's coupled with a negative view of physical existence. And that was certainly true among many Greek philosophers, it was true among the Gnostics, who said that Jesus only appeared to be a physical person, because why would a divine being sully the divine with contact with this fleshly existence that we really want to escape from? And so we get the view, by the time we're into the New Testament, it's firmly there that God will reward and punish in the afterlife, but it's thought of in terms of resurrection. So God raising the dead to a new bodily existence again.
I'm confused because I have a lot of thoughts going through my mind, but one is what you just said. I always looked at it as two separate things.
Okay.
Like your spirit, like you said, your spirit is one thing, and that's part of your judgment going to heaven, and your physical body is not going to happen until the resurrection of your physical resurrection.
Okay.
Won't happen until the resurrection of the second coming of Christ, or whatever, however you want to look at it. They're two completely separate. Did you just say they were the same thing?
Well, the issue that comes up is that when you try to weld together, and we'll probably need to stop soon and come back and pick it up again next time. One of the challenges philosophically is, do you need to have something like the Greek view of the soul in order to have resurrection be rewards and punishment for you rather than for a copy of you? Because if you cease to exist when you die, right, you stop existing, and then God brings you back to life essentially by recreating you, that might seem well and good, but it's the same issue that comes up for Star Trek fans with the transporter, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you've seen that video, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does it make a copy of you on the other end, or does it actually transmit you? So where does the personhood lie, and is there continuity? And that's a serious philosophical issue that people wrestle with. There's some evidence that at least some Jews thought in terms of ceasing to exist and then being restored to life. But there seems to be a combination of either the view that there's some kind of shadowy continuity of existence in Sheol or in some kind of land of the dead, and then that returns into bodily existence, at the resurrection, or that there are rewards and punishments immediately, but then that gets to the complicated question of, if there are rewards and punishments in the afterlife immediately, then what's the point of the resurrection? Right? Why bother with this extra step if people have already had rewards and punishments meted out to them? At this point, though, we're moving from the question of what does the Bible depict, to the question of how do we formulate a doctrine that takes seriously what the Bible depicts, takes seriously what we have in terms of additional information from neuroscience and other things like that, and how do we reflect on these things? Right? We do find Paul talking about being absent for the body as being present with the Lord, but he also says, I don't desire to be unclothed from the body, but I desire to be clothed with a new glorious body. And so we see in the New Testament this attempt to find a way of thinking about these things that preserves some kind of spiritual continuity, but also adheres to that view, that strongly Jewish view of resurrection, which affirms bodily existence as what God created people for.
Well, and then if you look at the LDS viewpoint, they call it spirit paradise, basically. I don't know if that makes sense, but you die, you go to heaven, but that's not your final destination of your soul. And when you die, and it's not really limbo like the Catholic purgatory. It's not that. It's like waiting for your judgment, because there are, God's time for judgment and our time for judgment. God's time is different than our time, so it may not be an instantaneous, you die and get judged. It's like we have to wait. It reminds me of a movie that was out in the 80s, which I can't think of what it was called.
Well,
Like,
can I make a sci-fi reference then, and throw in Lost in the picture, right? Where they end up, sorry for the spoiler if anyone's never seen it, but I imagine you're not going to go and watch it now.
They're all
But
dead.
yeah, so it's not that they're all dead throughout, right? Just let's get it out there, because some people still seem to have misunderstood the show, right? But by the end, in the final season though, right, we basically have a depiction of them in an afterlife. And at one point, one of the people asks his father, then why are you here now? And the father responds, because there is no now here. Right? So the idea that this place that they're in, there's no time there, time is different there, and so even though they died at different times, they all find themselves there together simultaneously. And so the question of how we think about time is relevant to this. How we think about human beings. Are we body and soul, body, soul, and spirit? Are we psychosomatic unities? And what's the appropriate thing to hope for? Is it for something that's like our existence now but more glorious, or is it something completely different?
But if we were all automatically resurrected, wouldn't there be zombies walking around the earth? I mean, like,
If we were what?
well, you were saying, like, if you die and you get resurrected, I'm viewing, because I always think of it as two separate things. Your soul going to heaven is one thing. Your soul rejoining with your body to be resurrected is a separate thing.
And what I'd like
Two
for us,
separate events.
and what I'd like for us to come back to next time, because we're out of time for today, is basically the question of how should we think about those things, right? Why do we posit certain things immediately after death? And I imagine that if we survey the range of opinions here, we'll find that there are a number of different viewpoints. And then also the question, how do we think we should think about it, right? So let's take a close look at what we think, ask why, and maybe change our minds or come up with some new ideas or consider other perspectives.
And I'm wondering, how does cremation fit into all of this?
We can relate that to the question too, right? How does that relate to belief in resurrection? Because certainly in Judaism, belief in resurrection impacted burial practices. But does it need to, right? Does, and to just give a little taste for next time, if the Romans, as part of their persecution of Christians who talk about the resurrection, burned Christians' bodies, scattered the ashes and water to scatter them around, would that work as a way of preventing the resurrection? Yes or no? But we'll come back to those kinds of questions
And
next
one
time.
more question.
One more?
I just got through binge watching Proof on TV.
Okay.
It was a program, and they talked about near-death experiences. And how does that tie in where people have like flatline and then come back?
Mhm.
Well, there's a whole thing in Buffy, spoiler, Buffy dies, and her friends bring her back. They do a resurrection spell to bring her back. And she's upset because she thinks she was in heaven. She's not sure, but she knows it was a better place than Earth. And she's mad at her friends because she was like, I was a hero. I died and went to heaven, and you guys thought I was in hell. Why would I have gone to hell if I was a hero and saved all these people? Basically, but
Yeah, so we'll pick up all these questions next time. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, we thank you for this opportunity to reflect on these things. We thank you for the recognition, even on this occasion, that there are different viewpoints expressed by different authors in the Bible, that there are different viewpoints expressed in our tradition at different times, that there are different views that people have heard and that we ourselves hold today. Help us to think about these things. Help us to recognize that there's no way to simply turn to some particular source and come up with a clear answer that gives us one picture that's organized and systematic. But help us to seek ways to think about these things that are glorifying to you, that make sense, and that give expression to our core beliefs and convictions. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.